Hello, and welcome to our next program. Well, this program is a little different. The program here will now begin with a song. The music of Count Basie, Duke Ellington, and Louis Armstrong forms the soundtrack of the 20th century America, making revolutionary notes that echoed through the civil rights movement in the hands of these skilled Black performers. In this new book, The Jazzmen, journalist Larry Tye brings together the stories of three men who grew up poor and found richness in music, then gave that fortune to the world. Larry will be interviewed by Chicago Tribune reporter Gregory Pratt, but first, we'd like you to listen to some of the music that inspired this book. Here to play for us are the Richard D. Johnson Trio.
So you can all go if you want to now. This is the, you've got...
You know, it's every once in a while you get to do something as a little treat, and starting with a concert is a nice little treat. And so, you know, we were, thank you all for being here. We're excited to be here and to talk with you. You know, Larry, one of the interesting things about this book is there are several early jazz greats, including Jelly Roll, Morden, Buddy Bolden, Sidney Bechet, King Oliver. Why did you choose these three to focus on in your book?
So I chose these three because the guys who pointed me to this book told me that these were the three that were their favorites. And those guys were the black men who worked on the railroad from the end of the Civil War for 100 years to the 1960s. They were called Pullman Porters. There were more of them in Chicago, where the Pullman Company was based, than anywhere. And they told me for a very specific reason, that when in those days, black men, even if they were as illustrious as Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Count Basie, when they went south to perform, if they chose the wrong restaurant to try to eat in, or the wrong hotel to try to rent a room, it could be the last decision that they had made. And it was a Jim Crow era, and it was a harsh era. And so what they did when they had the resources was they would hire private Pullman sleeping cars to go with them when they went below the Mason-Dixon line. When they were performing, those cars were pulled off on a sidetrack. And after their concert at night, the musicians would go back to that Pullman sleeping car, knowing they had an extraordinary meal waiting for them, they had a plush bed that the Pullman porters had made, and that they would be safe. And in return, what these musicians did for the Pullman porters was, in the middle of the night, they would have a private jam session just for the Pullman porters. And I don't know about you, Greg, but if I could go back at any moment in history, in that closed capsule of this railroad car, to have the Duke Ellington Band performing just for me would not be a bad way to go.
You don't say. That would, that's pretty spectacular. And you know, your answer touches on one of the themes that I wanted to ask you about, one of the things I wanted to talk about here, which is, can you put into context the importance of Armstrong, Ellington, and Basie in American music writ large, not just in jazz, but in general?
So in general, they were geniuses, and there are a lot smarter people who have written about their lives in the music world than me, two of whom are sitting here in our audience today. But I wrote about them because, not just because the Pullman Porters picked out those three, but because in addition to their, I think, being three musicians who will last forever, for as long as people's toes can tap and hands can do what mine was doing during this great performance earlier in Jiggle, I think that they did things in their own unique ways. Duke Ellington gave us, and people debate the number, but the number I landed on is 6,000 original compositions, along with arrangements that he did, along with extraordinary piano playing and band leading. Louis Armstrong was not a terrific band leader, but he, not far from here, in the Loop in Chicago, in a recording studio that was a portable one and the size of a postage stamp, he gave us a set of recordings that next year will turn 100, the so-called Hot Fives followed by the Hot Sevens, which showed that he could do two things. One is he could play a trumpet like nobody had ever played before, and the other was it gave us an early instinct of what he was able to do with his voice. And back in that era, his voice was so appreciated by young kids in Chicago that during winter, they would stick their head out of their cars trying to catch a cold so that they could sound like Louis Armstrong. And Count Basie, who probably on our Mount Rushmore was my most controversial choice, I think did something that neither of the other two did. Sublimated his ego to the goal of trying to get his side men and side women to be the stars on the band. And I think he was a band leader unlike any that we had seen before, and maybe unlike any that came after. And they used to say with Count Basie that if your toes weren't tapping when you were listening to Count Basie's music, you ought to go to the doctor the next day because something was anatomically wrong with you.
You know, and as far as the trio, what's interesting about Basie being controversial is that pick. You know, whenever you write, whenever you rank, whenever you try to put things into historical context of any sort, it can be controversial. It can get heated. To this day, many people consider Armstrong the face of jazz. And why is that? And what do you think about that?
So why he was the face of jazz is easy. You listen to him play his trumpet and you listen to him sing. But he became much more than that. He became, in the 1950s and 60s, it was rightfully said that the two most recognizable Americans in the world were Mickey Mouse and Louis Armstrong. And he became an ambassador not just for jazz, not just for music, but I think for America, to the point where the State Department recognized what an incredible the symbol they had here, and they sent Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Count Basie in their bands around the world as unofficial jazz or cultural ambassadors. And in an era, so I'm looking out at the audience, and most people lived through the very heated Cold War. And you remember in that era when the Soviet Union and America were trading barbs over everything, the most potent argument that I think the Russians had that things were not going well in America was American racism. And Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Count Basie, in their own ways, all spoke up about that until they got out of America. And as soon as they crossed the sea or wherever they were going to another part of the world, they became uber patriots. And when Russian reporters would ask them when they were doing tours behind the Iron Curtain, what is it about America and will you ever get the race situation right? They said, we are fixing it. Yes, there were racism, but yes, it is getting better. And the State Department proved brilliant. They couldn't have found better people to serve as these cultural ambassadors. And everywhere they went, they filled stadiums with thousands, if not tens of thousands of people in Africa, in Eastern Europe, all across the Middle East. And it's a long-winded answer to say these guys were extraordinary, and Louis Armstrong was extraordinary for things that went well beyond what he could do with his trumpet and his voice.
And, you know, by that token, he goes abroad and he could defend the country, but he would, sometimes some music lovers have trouble with Armstrong. You know, they talk about him as a people pleaser, as eager to please, and they're critical of that side of his legacy. Can you talk about that?
So, Greg, you're being polite. What actually people said was that he was an Uncle Tom or an Aunt Jemima, which are about the most cutting blows that you could give a black man in that era or any era. And this is a guy who grew up in a neighborhood of Jim Crow segregated New Orleans that was so tough that it was called the battlefield. And this was a guy who was told his entire life, this is a water fountain you can use, and this is a whites-only water fountain, or a public park, or a school system. And the idea that he was being accused of being an Uncle Tom, he actually took it from both sides of the debate. So he was accused of that, and he knew how unfair that was, but the world knew how unfair that was when, in the 1950s, in probably the most controversial civil rights confrontation in the 1950s, in Little Rock, Arkansas, where the courts had said Little Rock had to desegregate its all-white schools, and especially its all-white Central High School, the racist governor of Arkansas was a guy named Orville Faubus. And Armstrong had one night a young reporter about your age, I think, who came in and said, what do you think about that? And Louis Armstrong called the governor of Arkansas a word that begins with M and ends with R, and it got translated in the newspaper. That was a little too controversial for a family newspaper to print that word. So it ended up, he was called a country bumpkin or something like that. They softened it, but he called our war hero president Dwight Eisenhower, who had not sent in any troops to protect these young kids who were being told to desegregate this high school, he called him a gutless so-and-so. And he took it, on the one hand, from the press that was a racist press in America, including in Arkansas, where they accused him of being an unpatriotic American and said you ought to go look for someplace else to live. The other press that had been calling him an Uncle Tom continued to do that when I think Louis Armstrong had the perfect pitch for understanding what America needed at that moment. And while a lot of presidential historians would dispute what I'm about to say, I think it was because of him more than anybody that Dwight Eisenhower finally sent in federal troops to protect those students. So he was called a lot of things. He saw that it was not a contradiction in terms to be an entertainer and to be an artist. And he was the best of both. He played to white audiences, he played to mixed race audiences, and he continued to play to black audiences.
So, and I don't want to digress too much, but one of the great joys of being a newspaper reporter is the debates about bad words that we have behind the scenes. You know, there's a rule that you don't want to ruin someone's breakfast with their paper, and so you have to be careful what you say. So, country bumpkin is not the first synonym I would think of, but I guess it works. Armstrong is taking it from both sides, and as far as that debate goes, and what sort of lesson is there broadly for musicians or anyone that speaks out and finds themselves walking right down the middle of the road, getting it from both sides?
So the lesson is don't walk down the middle of the road. If you're going to get hit from both sides, no matter what you say what you believe. And all three of these musicians said, we will let our music speak for us. Duke Ellington especially, every time he was confronted, what do you think about this racial situation or that one? He would say, my music speaks for me. Well, in fact, that was half true, and his music did speak for him. He used to say that jazz ought to be renamed Negro music because it was all about a black experience. And he let his music speak for him at times in magnificent symphonies like Black, Brown, and Beige, which told the story of race in America from slavery to a civil rights era. Even more, he let his music speak for himself when he wrote a play called Jump for Joy. And my favorite song from that is one that Duke finally really decided he was going to let it all come out in terms of what he really thought. And it was in a song called King Fit the Battle of Alabama. And what that was about was a guy named Bull Connor in Birmingham, Alabama, who was the police chief who turned the hoses on young black demonstrators. And if there was a singular moment and a singular picture from the civil rights era, it was Bull Connor turning those hoses on the demonstrators, and it was Duke Ellington memorializing that in a song. But Ellington, for all that he said he wanted to let his music speak for him, as the 50s turned into the 60s, and as demonstrations became more widespread, he did more than speak through his music. In Baltimore, when Johns Hopkins students were staging a sit-in at a restaurant that would not serve blacks, Duke Ellington joined him in the sit-in, and every newspaper in America that was covering the civil rights movement said that was a signature moment, and he made headlines. Count Basie was doing the same thing in 1945, before any bands ever thought to do this. Count Basie said, I will not play where my bandmates, my integrated band cannot be, and when the audience cannot include blacks. And that was 20 years before most people, including Ellington and Armstrong, were doing those kinds of things. And we already talked about Louis Armstrong. I think that you might ask, any skeptical reader and anybody who knows anything about jazz might ask, why did the world need the 1001st book on Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie? And my answer is that my book is trying to look at the other half of their legacy, their lives off their bandstands, and I think that is where they made as important a contribution, and that's a very high bar to say that, but as important a contribution as they did in their music.
And that gets us into the writing and researching and reporting and synthesizing process of writing, aka agony. Can you talk about the just what kind of work? How long did you work on the project? When did you decide to do it? And what all went into it?
So, hearing you phrase the question reminded me of your book on Lori Lightfoot, and that was, I'm sure, an agonizing, you had covered every day of her mayoralty, but you had to go back and do it as an author, and that's a different process. And I want to say a couple things about the process of writing this book. This was my 9th book, and it was different than anything I had ever done before. I was writing about 3 different people, and I was incredibly naive. I thought if you're writing a biography of 3 people, you only had to do a third of the work that you would do in writing a biography of any one person. And I discovered at the end that you had to, nobody cared that only a third of my book was being written about Duke Ellington. They wanted to know that I knew about his whole life as if he was my only subject. So I ended up, when I'm starting to write, I print out all my notes, which means the transcript of 250 interviews that I did, along with all the readings I did in newspapers and magazines and books. And my printout was exactly 10,000 pages, which means it's what I did every day as a daily journalist, only on some sort of steroids and by a factor of many more than any book that I'd ever written. And so the toughest part of writing a book like this is not getting the story right, because you've got 250 people who help steer you to get the story right. The toughest is, what do you leave out, and how do you organize 10,000 pages into a 300-page book? And the answer is, I'm still not sure, and you have to leave out a lot of stuff that probably ought to be in there. But I also want to say that the previous book that I had written, my books now, I take 3 years to research and write the books, and that is 2 more years than I did it when I was a journalist on book leaves from the Boston Globe. And my previous book was a biography of a guy that you may have heard of named Joe McCarthy. And I was writing that book during the Trump presidency, and it was sort of looking at McCarthy, but the book was called Demagogue, because it was about all the demagogues who came before McCarthy and all the ones who have come since. And this book was my publisher's reward to me for having spent 3 years with Joe McCarthy. If you spend 3 years with as dark a figure as that, the idea of calling it work when you can spend 3 years with guys like Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie, it was the biggest joy that I've ever had in this book writing process.
I thought you were going to say that you just sat around jamming and the words came to you magically through the power of... I wish that's how it worked as well. If you could pick one album that best represents each of these, or one piece that best represents each of these 3 musicians, what would it be?
So I picked in my book, I had one chapter that looked at what their signature songs were early in their career, and a second one that looked at their signature songs later in their career. And the trajectory that all 3 of these guys went on was one that their music and what they picked as their signature said a lot about who they were and how they changed. And with Louis Armstrong, his signature song early on, and one he used to play in every performance he gave, was a song that was part of the controversy of Louis Armstrong. It was a song called When It's Sleepy Time Down South. And it was a song that, to the casual listener, seemed to glorify plantation kind of life in the South. And if there was anybody on this planet who knew better than to glorify that, it was a kid who grew up in that world and ended up at age 13 being grabbed off the street to spend 18 months in a reform school that was called the Colored Waifs Home for Boys. And anybody who spends time in a harsh environment like that knows that this guy would never glorify. But he also was trying to say something about a whole culture that he had left behind. And I think that song and how he reacted to the controversy that it created said a lot about who Louis Armstrong was when he was inching his way along to feel comfortable in playing to mixed-race audiences and understanding how critics would attack him. His signature song at the end of his life was a very different song. And in my mind, the signature at that point was Hello, Dolly. And Hello, Dolly was the song. You may remember that there was a play starring Carol Channing, and Louis Armstrong played Hello, Dolly in a way that normally it's the play that has a song, lets a song get exposure and become famous. It was his singing of Hello, Dolly that made the play famous. And this song was estimated to be played 10,000 times a day in America at that time on radio and everywhere, and sold 3 million copies. And at age 63, Louis Armstrong knocked the Beatles off the number one Billboard chart, and it was almost exactly, I think it was 60, so it was 60 some odd years ago that this 63-year-old man had a number one hit and was more popular than the Beatles. The songs for the other two, the Count Basie, it may have been the song here that could have been his signature song, the sound that the musicians were playing earlier, but he had songs that were all about jumping, and it was jumping at the woodside or 1 o'clock jump. He was the ultimate toe-tapping band leader at the early part of his career. At the end of his career, he had a song that became famous not just worldwide, but galaxy-wide, called Take Me to the Moon. And it was an extraordinary tune that actually was on the moon with astronauts playing it in their recording and therefore playing it for all the millions of people who were following him on Earth. And the most famous version of that was the Count Basie Band with Frank Sinatra playing the tune. Duke Ellington, I'm going to just pick one Ellington song because this answer is going on too long, but I want to pick his ultimate signature song. My guess is if I took a survey in this audience and I asked you one Ellington tune, people would say, Take the A Train, because that was the song he was best known for. And that song said two things about Ellington. One is his toe-tapping brilliance, and the other is his thievery. And the song was actually written by a young protege named Billy Strayhorn. And Billy Strayhorn was coming from Pittsburgh to New York to interview with Duke Ellington for a job. And Ellington gave him directions on how to get to where Ellington lived in Harlem. And he said, as part of those directions, you take the A train to get to me. And Strayhorn was such a genius that he decided the best way to get the job was to show Ellington he could convert those prosaic directions into a brilliant song. He did that, Ellington recognized it, and about a third of the time when Ellington played that song, he would credit Billy Strayhorn. The other 2/3, he wanted the audience to believe it was his song. And it seemed like that was a prerogative for a brilliant band leader. They could sometimes take credit for things that their side men and side women did, and other times give them proper credit.
I actually wanted to ask you about Strayhorn and how much credit you think he deserves for Ellington's success and whether he gets the recognition he deserves.
So I think Strayhorn was maybe the most clear genius of all the side men and side women that Ellington had, and he had scores of them over the years. But the idea, none of them, including Billy Strayhorn, deserves the credit that Duke Ellington did. If Billy Strayhorn had not been tapped by Duke Ellington to come to New York and to do all the composing that he did, the world would never have heard of Billy Strayhorn, but they still would have heard of Duke Ellington. And people have written entire books trying to parse out which songs were Strayhorn inspirations and which were Ellington inspirations. But I think the true Mount Rushmore character, nobody should question that it was Duke Ellington who belonged there and that he did more in making his sidemen famous than they did in making him.
So, we're talking about three different musicians, three legacies. Do you have thoughts on what contemporary musicians are best carrying on their legacies and best sort of fit in similar molds as they did?
So I think anybody who plays jazz today is carrying on their legacy. And every jazz musician that I interviewed said that they were standing on the shoulders of Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie. And from the music we heard before to the music we'll hear when you can get relief from these talking heads by hearing more toe-tapping music, these guys didn't just write the songs that they did or play the songs that they did and have an influence through that. They changed the whole way jazz is done. And I think that if I could point to one single moment more than any that changed jazz, it was again in Chicago when Louis Armstrong was in that little studio cutting his hot fives and hot sevens. You just couldn't do it the same afterwards.
On a music question and a writing question, how would you contrast Ellington and Basie's approach to large ensemble writing?
So I'm going to defer on that question. I want to say that I started out writing this book, and I was what I like to call tone deaf, and I ended up equally tone deaf. But in between the process of starting and knowing as little about music as I did, and I used to have to ask my wife, and I'm embarrassed to say this, the difference between harmony and melody and all kinds of other questions that anybody who had taken 5th grade music course knew. But the good thing about doing that is what I did every day as a journalist when I, for 20 years, would start the day not knowing anything about the topic that I was going to have to write for hundreds of thousands of readers about at the end of the day. And what I did between that ignorance at the beginning of the day and writing the story at the end was I talked to people a whole lot smarter than me. And that is what I did in writing this book. And I had people from, again, the 2 guys sitting here, to Wynton Marsalis and John Batiste and anybody you named, 2 interviews with the wonderful Sonny Rollins. If I had gone to them and said, I'm a smart journalist writer, and I just want to get a quote from you, but I know everything there is to know about Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie, they would have hung up the phone. Instead, if you called them and said, I have to write a book about these 3 guys, and I need you to educate me to understand what was special about them so I don't embarrass myself and you and Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie, they said, at the end of the interviews, they said, here's my cell phone, and call me whenever you need. I interviewed relatives and friends. I interviewed a guy named Bill Clinton who called one day to talk about Joe McCarthy, and we ended up talking jazz, and who swore to me, he swore 2 things. One is that he had posters of Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie in his home and in his office, and I want to believe him. He's a politician, but I do want to believe him.
That's a bad idea.
He also swore to me that he would show me sometime, we were talking during the pandemic, and he said, when you come to New York, call my press secretary, and I will have you out to my house to show you those posters. And that part of his promise he hasn't yet kept, but I'm going to keep calling.
How did you end up getting him off the phone? I'm surprised you're not still on.
That's a really interesting question, because it was during the pandemic, as I mentioned, and I had come from the one live talk that I did during the pandemic, and that was in the tiny village that I live in on Cape Cod. And they decided to have a strange talk about a guy who's writing a book on jazz. I hadn't written a word of it yet. And it was held, there's a baseball league on Cape Cod called, not surprisingly, the Cape Cod Baseball League. And 2 people here were at my talk on Cape Cod, and they can say whether I'm telling the truth or not. But it was an outdoor talk, which was the only safe way to have it, and it was partly a coming out talk for the community which was tired of being sequestered in their homes. And I get home, and there's a voicemail, and the voicemail says, this is Bill Clinton's press secretary. Would you give a call? The president wants to talk to you. And I thought it was some friend playing a joke, so I call and say, okay, I'll play along. And they said, just stay home for the next 5 minutes and we'll give a call. Well, if there's anybody in the world, other than maybe Louis Armstrong, that you can't duplicate their voice, it was Bill Clinton. And when he got on, I knew it was him. And getting him off, so it should have been that he said to me, I've got a million post-presidential things to you, goodbye. Instead, I said to him, I know you've got a million post-presidential things to be doing, and goodbye. But my guess is we could have spent hours, and he was totally captivating. So anyway, he was totally captivating.
I have a rule with a few Chicago politicians that if they call, I need to get off the phone in 10 minutes or else it will never end. But I digress. Obviously there's enormous interest in these 3 musicians and in jazz, and particularly in Chicago. Do you think that obviously they're all, by the same token, they're all long gone. Do you think that they still have the same? Is their importance to our culture acknowledged as much as it should be at this time?
So the simple answer, and if I could ever answer anything in one word, it would be no. And I think that their importance to American culture was not acknowledged during their time, and it has not been acknowledged since then, which was the point of writing this book. And the response that I'm getting from the press, suggests that maybe I'm right, so I'm an inveterate self-promoter of my books, and I wrote my first book on a man named Edward Bernays, who was a so-called father of public relations. He was Sigmund Freud's double nephew, and he used his uncle's ideas on why people behave the way they do to change that behavior to coincide with whatever politician or company he was representing. And I'm taking the Bernays approach to getting word out on this book. You write a book partly to give you an excuse to tell a story to a lot more people than will ever read even the biggest bestseller of a book. You know, if you reach one New York Times audience, you're multiplying by a factor of something the number of people who would ever look at even a Stephen King book. And so when I wrote this book, I have taken it out to all the print press and all the radio press and all the TV press that I could get to listen. And I'm astounded at whether it's the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, who have all either done or are doing things on it. They are doing things at a length and letting me speak about it in my voice, which suggests not that my voice is brilliant, but that they missed a story. And the story is, again, the story of what these three guys did to influence America. And this past week, I had a piece that ran in across a chain called McClatchy, which is a newspaper chain that is supposedly read by 65 million people. And the story was that last week, I don't know if any of you know, was the 70th anniversary of the most important, I would argue, Supreme Court case in American history, which was Brown versus Board of Education. And the story that I was telling was the story that another guy told much more compellingly 70 years ago, named Martin Luther King, who said, without jazz and without what these jazz musicians are doing, we would never have been able to integrate America's schools. And his argument, which is my argument in the book, is that we never go in a straight line to social change like Brown versus Board. There are a lot of side routes that we take. And my argument was that white men, back in the era of Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie, who would never have let a black cross their threshold, wooed their sweethearts with the music of Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. That white women who, if a black man had come walking towards them on the street, would have gone to the other side of the street, in the privacy of their living rooms, tapped their toes to the music of Count Basie and his band. It was the story that for once race ceased to matter when you were listening to great artists like these three. And it was not that they were great black jazzmen, they were great musicians. And I argue that it was impossible to listen to their genius without somewhere in the back of your head saying, how could I be a racist on one hand and say that these are people who are creating the most extraordinary music that I've ever listened to. So again, I think that the press is very good about covering stories that they felt they missed because they think they're the smartest people on the planet, and if they missed it, the world must have.
You know, it's almost like you've been around a newspaper or something for a period of time. So we're going to wrap up. We're going to have the band come back out. We want to thank you all for being here. And Larry, thank you for everything you do to keep these men's legacy alive and add to the discussion.
So thank you. Thank you.
And now, to close out the program, let's welcome the Richard D. Johnson Trio back to the American Writers Festival stage. Thank you so much. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Gregory.